Hi everyone, Maria from the Watershed Center here. Today we're covering day one of our stream investigation lesson plan series. This is an indoor, classroom-based part of the lesson designed to provide scaffolding information for students moving forward with subsequent lessons in the series. It starts out with an introduction section with some visuals on slides, and then there are a couple of hands-on activities. So let's dive in. A couple of quick notes on setup before we start. Students do work in small groups for the majority of this lesson. You will also need access to water for filling some containers before students arrive. Students will have solutions left over from their activities at the end of each lesson that will need disposal. So I'll go over lesson prep in more detail in just a moment, but if you are going to have several class periods in a row, for example, without access to either of those things, it can be useful to fill up a few Nalgene's, have a water cooler available for filling containers, and then potentially have a bucket or some other disposal system available for students to dump their solutions at the end of their lesson. All solutions are safely disposable down the sink, but it's good to have a place to put them. Other materials you'll need for this lesson include your 3 water samples, which we'll go over how to make in a moment. They need to be labeled. You'll need 2 small vials also labeled, but these are labeled sample 2 and sample 3. I'll explain later. You will need some disposable paper cups for students to use. You can even use the tiny little Dixie cups. You'll need a pH scale visual, and then you'll need a way to test pH. And you can do that using test tabs like you see here, or you can even use paper strips, and we'll talk about how to use both. Do note that each small group will need all of these materials. So as an instructor, you'll need to do some math to figure out how many water samples, how many paper cups, etc. Okay, so before your students arrive, you'll need to do a little bit of prep in the form of creating the solutions they'll be using in their activities. You can use any see-through containers for this activity as long as it has a lid. I chose some old water bottles. You will need to number them, and it does matter which one is which. There are instructions in the lesson plan on what to put in each bottle and how much, but basically in bottle number 1 there's a small amount of food coloring, in bottle number 2 there's some salt, and in bottle number 3 there's some lemon juice. When your students arrive, you can go ahead and get started by splitting them into small groups. Usually 3 to 5 students per group is best. So now it's time to kick off the lesson by asking a few key questions to get students thinking about water and water quality. So first we want to know, what is a watershed? And we can talk about that as a class. We can use these images as a mental guide to sort of start thinking about that concept. We can ask which watershed students are in. Often if they can name nearby creeks and rivers, they'll hit on the name of the watershed. And this is useful because it's good to ground this knowledge in something local and relatable. So if they can talk about their watershed, they can start to think about water in their communities. We want to ask why clean water is important to a watershed. A lot of these images will start to sort of suggest concepts for students about why we need clean water. And then the final question for now is, what measurements can we take to help understand water quality? You may need a water quality definition at this point for students as we're really diving into these concepts. This definition can be a bit lengthy, so I sometimes focus on this middle line where it talks about the biological, chemical, and physical conditions of water. Thinking about those 3 words can sort of lead students to think about what observations they might make, what measurements they might take in order to understand a sample of water and what kind of water quality it has. And that leads us right into our first activity. You'll want to hand out 1 of each water sample to each small group, and then each small group also gets a worksheet. So this activity is all about students making observations about the water samples they've been given. So they can use any sense they like. They can use vision, touch, smell, taste to make observations, and then they use the worksheet to record what they're observing. In the middle column, they can make a guess as to the contents of the water bottles, which will be revealed at the end. A couple of things to note for students. You can let them know that the samples are all safe for consumption, but that they might not taste very good, so be careful how much they choose to drink. And also note that students should have at least half of their sample bottle left over for the second activity, so they don't want to consume all of one bottle for this activity alone. When students have finished filling out their worksheet, you can gather everyone back together, you can take a look at student guesses, you can reveal the contents of each water bottle, and discuss how easy or difficult it was to determine the different properties of the water samples they were given. And this leads us nicely into the next activity. You can lead in by saying when we are out in the field and we're looking at water samples from a river or a pond, and it's obviously not okay to drink the water, sometimes it helps to have specialized testing equipment to look at water quality. So for this activity, students will keep their water samples, minus a bit now. They will need their pH scale, visuals, they'll need their vials, and they'll need your chosen pH testing equipment. Quick note for instructors here, this activity involves testing pH, and we are going to use specifically samples 2 and 3. If you're using the pH test tablets that dissolve in the solution, it turns the actual solution the color indicating the pH. So if you're using sample 1 that has the food coloring in it, you're going to get skewed results. So make sure that students understand they're going to be testing samples 2 and samples 3. When starting this activity, I like to put instructions for testing pH up on the board so students can reference back to them. If you are not using the slides included with this lesson plan, you can easily look up instructions online or just verbally review this with your students and make sure they feel comfortable with the process. Once students are ready, they will measure samples 2 and 3 out into the associated vials to make sure your vials are labeled. And then they will proceed to measure the pH and record it on their worksheets. When students are finished with this activity, you can bring everyone back together, review the pH that everyone came up with for their different solutions, and then debrief a little bit by talking about how water quality is often about balance. So we consumed a little bit of lemon juice and salt, food coloring today, and it was fine, but in higher concentrations, these things can be unpleasant or even harmful, and that applies to all of the water quality measurements that we'll be taking. Take some time with this activity if this is the first time your students have encountered this equipment. This is very similar to a lot of the processes that they'll be using during their field data collection day, and you want to make sure that new equipment isn't a barrier to their learning during that day. So now that students are familiar with one sort of scientific measurement we can take to better understand water quality, we're going to review all 4 of the water quality indicators they will be measuring at the stream when they go out on their field data collection day. There are 4 slides included in the lesson plan to help you go over this, but we want to review pH, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, and nitrate. Review the definitions with students just briefly and make sure they understand what each of these indicators measure and what they mean for our water quality. The very last question we want to ask with students is how might water quality change when we're comparing upstream watershed locations with downstream locations? This is really where the rest of the lesson plan series is heading, so we want to take time here to get students thinking about what impacts water quality. We can ask students to come up with a list of reasons themselves, working in their small groups, but we want to take time to go through all of these water quality impacts. A lot of times students have only really received language about things like pollution and stormwater runoff, but we want to incorporate thinking about floods and wildfires and droughts and climate change into this lesson to prepare students for some of the activities and concepts that are coming later in the series. Once you've had time to review water quality impacts, it's time to wrap up. So you can remind students that they'll be taking these skills out into the real world soon, and we will talk about that in the next video. Thanks for watching.